Images and stories of the Hill Country floods, they can be a lot for adults, but a lot for children to process. Our Emma Byrne shares guidance from a counselor tonight on how parents can help kids make sense of what is happening.
When disaster strikes, children are often watching and listening more than adults realize.
It starts with trying to understand what the child knows already, asking them if they've heard anything about it, or if the child comes to them asking them questions about what happened.
Instead of shielding kids from topics, Ryan Oakley at Alethea Family Counseling recommends parents should lean in and listen first, and then offer comfort.
You validate that fear, and then you offer them some comfort of, what happened actually was a very rare occasion. We don't really hear about things like this.
Even if families were not directly impacted, kids can still carry fear and confusion. Oakley says talking through tragedies in an age-appropriate way will help them understand. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, parents should be on the lookout for these signs that their children are having difficulty coping with tragedy. Sometimes it can be hard to tell if a child is reacting in a typical way or having significant problems coping. That's why the AAP and Oakley recommend starting discussions early.
With the tragedy that happens with the flood or with the hurricanes that happen every year or tornadoes, these are definitely conversations that a parent can have, unpacking their fears, validating them.
These conversations don't need to be perfect. Just honest, age-appropriate, and reassuring. Emma Burns, KOTV 7 News.
Those experts there also advise limiting the amount of disaster coverage that your kids are getting access to and seeing.